There is a moment, and if you are watching this, you have almost certainly had it, where you gave someone the full weight of your care, your attention, your emotional presence, and what came back was something that did not match what you gave. Not once. Not as an isolated disappointment that anyone could absorb and move past. Repeatedly. In the same relationship or across several of them, with the same slow, accumulating quality that made it worse than a single sharp blow would have been. Because a single sharp blow announces itself, demands a response, forces a reckoning. What repeated hurt does to an empath is quieter than that, and far more consequential. It does not arrive like a storm. It arrives like water through a hairline crack in a wall. Slow, patient, invisible until the day the wall is no longer there, and neither is the version of the person who was once behind it. Daniel Goleman spent decades studying the emotional interior of human beings, how they process feelings, how they regulate them, how they build the internal architecture that allows them to function in relationship with others without being destroyed by those relationships. His research, which produced the 1995 work that reframed how the world understood human intelligence, documented something about highly empathic people that most of the self-help literature has spent 30 years softening into comfortable irrelevance. The truth, stated plainly, is this. The empath is not built for the world as it actually operates. They are built for the world as it should operate. A world where emotional attunement is met with reciprocal care, where sensitivity is honored rather than exploited, where the capacity to feel what others feel produces connection rather than exposure. And when that world fails to materialize, when the empath encounters again and again the gap between the world they were built for and the world they are living in, what happens inside them is not what most people assume. It is not simple sadness. It is not temporary disappointment. It is a transformation, deep and largely invisible, that reshapes the entire internal landscape of who they are and how they will move through every relationship that follows. What follows in this content is that transformation, mapped with the precision that Goleman's framework makes possible and the honesty that the subject demands. Every stage of it, what it looks like from the outside, what it feels like from the inside, what it costs, and what, if anything, can be recovered from it, and what, if you are in it or past it, you are meant to do with everything it changed in you. Before going any deeper, if this is the content that finally puts language to something you have been living without the words for, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. And turn on the notification bell because what gets built here is honest, research-grounded content that most platforms do not have the patience for. And do something that would genuinely mean something to this community right now. Drop your location and the exact time you are watching this in the comments. Whether it is a quiet Thursday morning in Manchester, a late Sunday night in Melbourne when the house has finally gone still, a rainy afternoon in Toronto when you finally have an hour to sit with something real, or an early morning in Atlanta before the day starts pulling you in 10 directions. Write it down, because the people watching this right now are spread all over the world, and many of them are sitting with the exact same internal experience that brought you here today. You are not alone in this. That matters more than it might seem right now. Now let us go into what actually happens. The first thing to understand is that the empath does not start from the same emotional baseline as most people. This is not a spiritual claim or a mystical one. It is a neurological one. Research into the mirror neuron system, the network of brain structures that fires both when a person experiences an emotion and when they observe that emotion in someone else, has established that highly empathic individuals demonstrate significantly heightened activity in this system compared to the general population. What this means in practical terms is that the empath is not choosing to absorb the emotional states of people around them. They are doing it automatically, at a neurological level, before the conscious mind has had any opportunity to assess, filter, or protect. The pain of the person next to them registers in their own body as something close to that person's pain. The joy of someone they love produces a genuine echo of that joy in their own nervous system. They are, in the most literal physiological sense, more porous than most people, more open to what enters from the outside, less capable of the natural insulation that protects emotionally average people from being destabilized by the emotional weather of the people they are close to. Goleman documented this porosity in his framework for emotional intelligence, specifically in what he described as emotional empathy, the capacity to physically feel what another person feels, as distinct from the cognitive understanding of another's emotional state. He identified this as one of the 3 forms of empathy available to human beings. And he noted that while it is among the most powerful connective forces available in human relationship, it is also the one that carries the greatest risk, because the person who feels others' emotions in their own body is the person most vulnerable to the emotional states of those around them, and therefore most exposed to the consequences of being in proximity to people who are in chronic pain, who are emotionally dysregulated, or who, consciously or not, draw on the empath's capacity for feeling as a resource they consume without replenishing. The first wound that changes everything is not necessarily the most dramatic one. It does not have to be betrayal in the classic sense, a sudden and visible reversal that announces itself as damage. For most empaths, the wound that begins the internal transformation described in this content is subtler than that. It is the moment when they realize, with a certainty that lands somewhere below conscious thought, that the care they have been extending, genuinely, consistently, from the deepest part of who they are, has been received in a way that does not match its quality, that the person they have been feeling for, absorbing for, staying awake at night for, that person has not been extending the same quality of attention in return. Not because they are necessarily malicious, but because they are not built the same way. And the empath, who has been assuming that everyone feels as they do, encounters for the first time the specific loneliness of a sensitivity that has no equivalent on the other side of the relationship. That realization is the crack in the wall. Everything that follows flows through it. Comment below, I release what no longer serves me. Because naming what this is, not a personal failing but a structural mismatch, is where the internal work begins. Here is what happens in the body of an empath when the hurt is not isolated, but repeated, when it comes in waves across weeks and months, building on itself with the particular cruelty of the familiar. The nervous system, which was designed to process emotional information and return to baseline, begins to fail at the return. Each new wave of pain arrives before the system has completed its recovery from the last one. And over time, the baseline itself shifts. What was once the empath's resting state, that open, receptive, warm availability that made them the person everyone brought their heaviest feelings to, begins to register as dangerous rather than natural. The nervous system begins doing what nervous systems do when the environment is consistently threatening. It begins building defenses that were never there before. The neuroscience behind this is documented and consistent. Research published in multiple peer-reviewed journals confirms that repeated emotional exposure to painful stimuli, particularly interpersonal pain, which activates the same neural pathways as physical pain in the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, produces measurable changes in the brain's stress response architecture. The amygdala, which Goleman described as the emotional center of the brain and the structure responsible for what he called the amygdala hijack, the flooding of the rational mind by intense emotion, begins to fire with less provocation over time in people who have experienced repeated emotional injury. The threshold drops. What once required a significant emotional blow to produce a fear response now produces that same response in ordinary interactions, because the system has been calibrated by its history to anticipate pain, even when none is immediately present. For the empath, this recalibration is particularly devastating because it attacks the very faculty that defines them. The mirror neuron system, which once oriented automatically toward connection, begins to orient toward threat. The same neurological sensitivity that made the empath capable of extraordinary emotional attunement now makes them exquisitely sensitive to the early signals of the pain they have learned to expect. They begin reading rooms not for the warmth available in them, but for the ways that warmth might be withdrawn. They begin hearing conversations not for what is being offered, but for what is being withheld. They begin loving people not from a position of abundant generosity, but from a position of managed expectation. And the love that emerges from that position is real but cautious, a shadow of what they are capable of, produced by a system that is still functioning but has learned from painful and repeated experience that full openness is a liability it can no longer afford. Drop in the comments, "Nothing external owns my center," because understanding the neurological mechanism of what is happening is the first step toward reclaiming governance of it. The trust collapse that follows repeated hurt in an empath is not linear, and it is not always visible to the people who caused it. It does not usually announce itself as a decision. The empath does not wake up one morning and choose to stop trusting. What happens is far more gradual and far more internal. A slow erosion of the assumption that made the empath who they are, the assumption that the world is fundamentally responsive, that care extended will be care returned, that emotional investment will be met with the reciprocal presence that makes investment worthwhile. The surface problem most people see is that the empath becomes less communicative, less available, less warm in ways that are difficult to attribute to any single incident. Colleagues notice they no longer lead with the openness they once had. Partners notice a quality of distance that was not there before and cannot be traced to a specific argument or event. Friends notice that reaching them requires more effort than it once did, that the conversations are real but slightly shorter, that the follow-through is less consistent, that the person who was once the most reliably present person in the room has developed a quality of selective absence that nobody quite understands. The empath themselves may not fully understand it, may attribute it to tiredness, to being busy, to needing space, because the internal mechanism producing the withdrawal is operating below the level of conscious awareness, in the same automatic, protective, non-deliberate way that all survival responses operate. The deeper root is what Goleman's framework identifies as a collapse in self-awareness. Specifically, the self-awareness that allows a person to recognize their own emotional states with clarity and to make conscious choices about how those states are expressed. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly begins to lose access to that clarity, not because they stop feeling, but because the volume of what they feel becomes too high to parse with the precision that self-awareness requires. The emotional interior gets noisy. The signals that were once clean and readable, this is joy, this is grief, this is love, this is the specific sadness of this specific thing, blur into a generalized emotional weather that is difficult to name and therefore difficult to navigate. And the person whose entire identity is built around their capacity to feel and to name feelings discovers that the instrument of their identity has been compromised by the very experiences it was most vulnerable to. The deepest psychological root of this trust collapse is what researchers in attachment theory, building on the foundational work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, have documented as anxious attachment recalibration, the process by which a person whose formative emotional experiences of care were inconsistent begins to reorganize their entire relational strategy around the management of potential abandonment rather than the cultivation of genuine connection. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly in adult relationships begins, at a neurological and behavioral level, to import this strategy into every new relationship, not because they want to, not because they have decided to, but because the nervous system has learned that the cost of full emotional openness is too high and has begun the quiet, automatic work of managing that cost by never quite opening all the way. What makes this particularly significant for the empath is the interaction between this attachment recalibration and their neurological sensitivity. The ordinary person who develops anxious attachment will scan their relationships for signs of inconsistency and withdrawal. The empath, whose mirror neuron system is already reading emotional subtext at a depth most people do not access, will scan those same relationships with an intensity that can become, over time, its own form of self-sabotage. They begin detecting the early signals of potential hurt so acutely that they respond to the shadow of abandonment before the abandonment itself has occurred, withdrawing preemptively, pulling back emotional investment before it can be rejected, constructing the distance that protects them at the exact moment when proximity might have produced the resolution they were seeking. The hurt they were protecting against gets produced in part by the protection itself. and the loop becomes very difficult to break without the specific quality of self-awareness that Goleman identified as the cornerstone of emotional intelligence. The ability to observe your own emotional patterns from a slight internal distance, and to ask whether the pattern is serving you or perpetuating the very experience it was designed to prevent. Comment below. My peace is not for sale, because the trust that was damaged can be rebuilt, but only after what damaged it has been named with this level of honesty. Pay careful attention here, because what follows is the internal process that is least discussed, most misunderstood, and most consequential for the long-term well-being of anyone who has ever identified as an empath and has been hurt enough times to feel the shift that this content is describing. When the empath's outward-facing empathy, the capacity to feel for others, to absorb their emotional states, to extend care into the world with the generosity that defines them, begins to be compressed by repeated hurt, something happens to that emotional energy that does not disappear. It does not evaporate. It does not resolve. It redirects, and the direction it redirects toward is inward. What was once the empath's extraordinary capacity to extend compassion outward becomes, in the context of repeated injury, a relentless and often merciless capacity for self-examination that turns the same sensitivity that once produced empathy for others into an unrelenting source of self-critical analysis that the empath applies to themselves with a thoroughness and a harshness that most people would never direct at someone they loved. The common definition of what this looks like is rumination, the repetitive, circular revisiting of painful events that behavioral psychology has documented as one of the primary drivers of depression and anxiety in highly sensitive individuals. But the inversion of that definition, the deeper truth that Goleman's emotional intelligence framework illuminates, is that this self-directed empathy is not a failure of thinking. It is a misapplication of a genuine gift. The empath, who is capable of extraordinary precision in reading the emotional subtext of other people's behavior, turns that precision on themselves and their own failures, revisiting every interaction, every choice, every moment where they may have contributed to the hurt they received, with an analytical rigor that would be impressive in any other context, and is, in this one, actively destructive. The mastery of understanding this mechanism lies in recognizing what it is actually doing. It is the empath trying to find the explanation for the hurt that gives them the most agency over preventing it in the future. Because if the hurt was their fault, if they were too much, or not enough, or too open, or not open in the right way, then they have the power to change the outcome by changing themselves. The alternative, that they were hurt not because of what they did or failed to do, but because of who they were in relationship with, and that no amount of self-adjustment would have produced a different result, is a far more disturbing conclusion, because it implies a vulnerability to the behavior of others that no amount of self-improvement can resolve. The self-directed empathy is, at its core, a defense against that conclusion. It is the mind choosing the pain of self-blame over the helplessness of accurate attribution. And it costs the empath, over months and years of this pattern, a quality of self-regard that is very difficult to reconstruct. Drop in the comments, my evolution is non-negotiable, because the recognition of this mechanism is not self-criticism. It is the beginning of the reversal. You have done this. You have gone quiet in a way that nobody around you fully understood, including yourself. You have been in conversations where the warmth that once came naturally required effort to produce, where the listening that was once automatic felt like work, where the care that defined you felt like something you were performing rather than something you were. And you told yourself it was tiredness, or that you needed more sleep, or that this particular relationship had run its course and you were moving on. It wasn't any of those things. Or rather, it was all of those things, but underneath all of them was something that none of those explanations adequately named. The accumulated weight of having been open enough, caring enough, present enough to absorb other people's pain into your own body, and having done so repeatedly, in contexts where the care was not returned at the level it was extended, until the system that produces the openness began to shut down not from weakness, but from the most basic survival intelligence available to any organism that has been consistently hurt in the same place. It learned, and what it learned was silence. The silence that follows repeated hurt in an empath is not peace. That distinction is important, and most people who are in it miss it entirely, because from the outside, it looks like composure, like maturity, like the particular dignity of a person who has decided not to engage with things beneath their standard. From the inside, it is none of those things. From the inside, it is the absence of something that was once the most alive part of the person. The absence of the emotional availability that made them who they were, replaced by a quiet that is not chosen but imposed, not peaceful but numb, not strong but exhausted. Goleman documented this state in his research on what happens to emotional intelligence under sustained stress. He found that the self-awareness that is the foundation of emotional intelligence, the capacity to recognize one's own emotional states accurately and in real time, is among the first casualties of chronic emotional overload. When the nervous system is persistently overwhelmed, the clarity of self-perception degrades. The person begins to lose the ability to distinguish between what they are feeling and what they are performing feeling. They begin to lose confidence in their own emotional reads of themselves and of others. And the empath, whose entire identity rests on the reliability of those reads, experiences this degradation as something close to a loss of self, not a dramatic loss, a quiet one, the kind that happens so gradually that it is only visible in retrospect, when the person looks back at who they were 3 years ago and does not entirely recognize them. The elevated behavioral reality here is this: the silence is not the destination. It is a stage, and the person who understands that, who can recognize the silence not as the end of who they are, but as the nervous system's temporary protective response to a level of hurt it has not yet found a way to metabolize, that person has the information they need to begin moving through it, rather than settling inside it. Comment below: I am becoming what most fear to be, because the person who names their own silence rather than rationalizing it has already begun the return. Here is where the territory becomes most difficult to map honestly, because it requires naming something about the transformation of a hurt empath that most content on this subject carefully avoids, because it is uncomfortable, because it challenges the narrative of the empath as perpetual victim, because it demands that the empath themselves sit with a truth about what has happened to them that is neither simple nor entirely flattering. When an empath is hurt repeatedly, they do not remain an empath in the original sense of the word. They harden, not completely, not permanently in most cases, but genuinely, measurably, in ways that are documented in the psychological literature on what chronic emotional injury does to the nervous system's capacity for openness. And the hardening carries costs that are paid not only by the empath, but by everyone in their orbit. The weak pole of this transformation is the empath who hardens without understanding that they have hardened, who carries the self-conception of a highly sensitive, deeply caring person while behaving, in their closest relationships, with a guardedness and a strategic emotional management that is the direct behavioral product of everything described in the previous stages. This person is not a hypocrite. They are a person whose self-image has not caught up with their survival responses. They still believe they are as open as they always were, still identify with the version of themselves that preceded the repeated hurt, while the people who know them most closely can feel the wall that was not there before, can feel the calculated quality of the warmth, the slightly managed quality of the vulnerability, the sense that they are being given access to a portion of this person that has been assessed as safe to share, rather than the full, unguarded presence they once offered freely. The strong pole is the empath who is hardened and knows it, who has named it, examined it, and made a conscious decision about what they want to do with the protection the hardening provides, and what they are willing to lose by maintaining it. That is an entirely different position. Not more comfortable, in many ways more painful, because it requires sitting with the honest inventory of what has been lost and what the loss has produced. But it is the position from which genuine recovery is possible, because genuine recovery cannot be built on a foundation of self-deception about where the person currently stands. The bridge between those two poles is the willingness to look at the hardening without shame, to recognize it as a rational response to irrational treatment, as the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, as evidence not of weakness, but of the organism's fundamental commitment to its own survival, and then to ask whether the protection it provides is still proportionate to the threat that produced it, or whether the cost of maintaining it has begun to exceed the cost of the vulnerability it was built to prevent. That question, whether the wall that was built for protection has become a prison, is one of the most important questions an empath can sit with after repeated hurt. Because the hardening that was necessary at the moment of its construction does not remain necessary forever. The person who caused the hurt may no longer be in the picture. The environment that produced the repeated exposure may have changed. The internal resources available for self-protection, the discernment, the boundaries, the capacity for governance that the hurt forced into development may have grown sophisticated enough that the full defensive wall is no longer required to produce safety. And yet the wall remains, because walls do not dissolve on their own. They require conscious assessment, the deliberate recognition that the conditions that made them necessary have changed, and the equally deliberate choice to dismantle them in precisely the degree that the new conditions allow. That work is not easy, but the empath who does it discovers something remarkable, that their sensitivity, which had been compressed behind the hardening, did not atrophy during the compression. It was waiting. Comment below, I am sovereign, because the empath who examines their own hardening without flinching from what they find is the most honest person in any room. The darkest part of what happens internally when an empath is hurt repeatedly is not the hardening. It is what emerges on the other side of the hardening, in the people who pass all the way through it and out the other side, which is a version of themselves that is neither the original open empath nor the defended, guarded product of their hurt. It is something that does not have a clean name in the popular psychology vocabulary, but that Goleman's framework can identify with precision. A person whose emotional intelligence has been reconstructed by suffering into something more sophisticated, more selective, and considerably more formidable than what they had before the hurt began. A person who still feels everything, but who has learned to choose, with a deliberateness and a clarity that the original empath never had, which feelings they act on, which people they extend toward, which environments they allow themselves to be open in, and which ones they enter wearing the composed armor of the person who has been through enough to know the difference. This is the entry-level version of the dark transformation. The empath who has been hurt enough to develop discernment, not the blanket openness of before, targeted openness offered to the people and environments that have demonstrated they can hold it, not the reflexive, automatic care of before, deliberate care, extended from a position of choice rather than compulsion. Not the vulnerability that comes from having no protection, the courage that comes from having been vulnerable and survived the cost of it. The deeper implication is what most people never examine. The empath who has been through this transformation has access to a form of social and emotional intelligence that people who have never been significantly hurt do not possess. They know what it feels like to have their openness exploited. They can recognize the early behavioral signals of that exploitation with a precision that comes only from having lived through it repeatedly. They can read the gap between what a person presents and what a person is with the specific, hard-won accuracy of someone who has made the mistake of trusting the presentation and paid for it. They are, in the most practical sense, significantly more difficult to deceive, more difficult to manipulate, and more difficult to exploit than the person they were before the hurt began. The darkest application of this transformation, the one that requires the most courage to acknowledge, is that the empath who has passed through repeated hurt and come out the other side with their sensitivity intact, but their naivety gone, has become, without intending to, one of the most strategically perceptive people available in any social or professional environment, because they feel what others feel, and they have also learned to watch what others do, because they extend care and they have also learned to protect it, because they are open and they have also learned, at a cost they did not choose to pay but cannot return, exactly where the boundaries of that openness must be drawn. Comment below, I see the board clearly now. because the transformed empath does not see less than they did before. They see more. There is a story about a woman. No name, no specific circumstance, because the details of this particular story are the details of thousands of stories, and the specificity of one would narrow what is meant to be universal. She was the person everyone called, the one who absorbed the grief of the room without being asked, who stayed on the phone at midnight because someone needed her to, who noticed what others missed, who named what others could not, who held space for feelings that the people experiencing them could not hold for themselves. She gave this freely and generously and without keeping score, because the giving was not a strategy. It was who she was, and she was hurt by this. Not once, repeatedly, across relationships and environments and contexts, by people who were not all villains, most of whom were decent people who did not have the capacity to return what she gave, and who, when she was no longer sustainably available, moved toward the next available source of what she provided. The principle extracted from our story is the one that Goleman's entire framework of emotional intelligence was built toward, but that the popular version of his work has largely failed to emphasize adequately. Emotional intelligence is not the capacity to feel more. It is the capacity to govern what you feel, direct where you extend it, and protect the interior conditions that make genuine feeling possible. Goleman was explicit on this point in his research. The emotionally intelligent person is not the most emotionally open person in the room. They are the person whose emotional faculties are most reliably in their own governance, most responsive to their own choices rather than to the automatic, compulsive pulls of their sensitivity. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly, and who has, through that hurt, arrived at the understanding that their sensitivity is a resource that requires governance rather than a river that flows wherever gravity takes it. That person has not lost their gift. They have, for the first time, actually begun to understand what it is for. The application for the person watching this, whether they are in the middle of the internal transformation this content describes, or have been through it, or are watching it happen in someone they love, is this. The damage is not the destination. The numbness is not permanent. The hardening, if it is examined honestly and metabolized rather than denied, is not the end of the empath's capacity for connection. It is the education of it, and the person who emerges from that education, who carries their sensitivity forward with the governance that the hurt forced them to develop, is not less than who they were. They are, in every measurable dimension that matters, more. Drop in the comments, I play the long game, because the empath who understands that their transformation is an education rather than a destruction has already chosen the right frame for everything that follows. Every stage of what has been described in this content, the neurological porosity that makes the empath's sensitivity both their greatest strength and their greatest vulnerability, the recalibration of the nervous system under repeated hurt, the collapse of trust that follows, the inward redirection of empathy that produces self-criticism, the silence that is mistaken for peace, the hardening that protects without announcing itself, and the dark transformation that produces something more formidable than what preceded it. These are not random, disconnected phenomena. They are a single, coherent process. The process by which a human being who is built with more than the standard allocation of emotional sensitivity encounters a world that does not have equivalent provisions for protecting that sensitivity, absorbs the cost of that mismatch across time, and is rebuilt by the absorption into something the original architecture could not have produced without it. Goleman's most important contribution to understanding this process is the recognition that emotional intelligence is not a fixed trait. It is a developed capacity, and the most significant development available to any highly empathic person is not the refinement of their ability to feel what others feel. They arrived with that in abundance. It is the development of the governance structures that protect their capacity to feel from being depleted by the environments that have learned to extract from it. Self-awareness, self-regulation, the ability to recognize their own emotional states clearly enough to make deliberate choices about them, the ability to stay present in difficult emotional terrain without being consumed by it. These are the dimensions of emotional intelligence that the hurt empath counterintuitively develops more fully than those who have never had to confront the cost of their own openness. There is a version of the empath who has been hurt repeatedly, who closes, who decides, at some point that felt like survival, that the alternative to being hurt is to feel nothing, to disconnect from the sensitivity that made them vulnerable, to build the wall high enough that nothing significant gets through, to trade the possibility of the pain for the certainty of the numbness. That person is not a failure. They are a person who did not have the information, the support, or the framework to understand what their sensitivity was for or how to protect it. The cost of their choice is real, for them and for the people who will never experience what they were capable of extending when they were fully themselves. There is another version, the version this content was built for. The empath who has been hurt enough to be changed by it, who has passed through the numbness and the hardening and the dark transformation, and who has arrived, on the other side of all of it, at the recognition that their sensitivity was never the problem, that what was needed was governance, the development of a relationship with their own emotional interior that is more deliberate, more boundaried, more selective, and ultimately more powerful than the open, undiscriminating generosity they began with. That version is not less warm. They are more deliberately warm, not less caring, more precisely caring toward the people and in the environments where care produces the reciprocal nourishment that sustains it, not less themselves, more sovereignly themselves, which is a different thing entirely from the empath who gives everything to whoever asks and waits, quietly and at great personal cost, for the world to notice. Most people who watch this will carry the emotional resonance of recognition and return to the patterns that produced the hurt in the first place, because change is difficult and the familiar is comfortable, even when it is painful. A few will take one of the stages described here and sit with it long enough to ask what it means for a specific relationship or situation in their life. And a rare few, the ones this was always built for, the ones who felt every stage of this content as a precise description of something they have been living through without the language to name it. Those people will take the entire framework, apply it to their own internal experience with the honesty it requires, and discover that what they have been calling their wound is actually the beginning of a transformation they did not consent to, but cannot return, and would not choose to return even if they could, because the person they are becoming on the other side of it is the person their sensitivity was always building toward, and they would not trade that person for the innocent and unguarded one they were before the hurt began. You already know which one you are. You knew before you started watching this. The choice is yours, and it begins right now, in whatever quiet or noisy or complicated space you are occupying as you sit with everything this content has named. If this content gave you something real, if it named something you've been carrying without the words for it, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel. The conversations being built here go deeper than most content is willing to go, and they are built for the people who are ready for that depth. And leave a comment below with the stage that hit you hardest, not the one that was new to you, the one you already knew was true and are finally ready to sit with honestly.